Today's episode of The Bluff is sponsored by SitRep. SitRep is a notorious open source intelligent app that provides the latest updates for over 180 countries and over 500 topics, allowing you to stay ahead and informed. Now available on Apple and Google. Thank you, SitRep, for sponsoring this episode.
Welcome back to the Bottom Line Up Front, an Artorias podcast. A lot has happened over the last week, so we'll be doing another episode of Global Intel. My name is Matt.
And I'm Stefano, the Chief Intelligence Officer of Artorias. And as Matt alluded to, a lot has happened in the last week. In this episode, we're going to cover Israel, Qatar, Russia, Poland, even Romania, Nepal, and Afghanistan and Pakistan, because simply put, a lot has happened, and we felt it was more appropriate to do another segment of Global Intel to cover the latest geopolitical crisis that's happened around the world. Because simply, this is one of the weeks that felt like it was a decade in the geopolitical sense. And that's why we're going to do this episode. And so, where we're going to start with right now is Israel, Qatar. And for our listeners, just a quick overview of what happened. Israel conducted an airstrike in Doha, consisting of F-15 their Air Force with F-15 fighter jets, launching air-launched ballistic missiles, reportedly, targeting a meeting that involved key leaders of the Hamas leadership based out of Qatar and Turkey. They were meeting in Qatar to analyze Steve Witkoff and the United States ceasefire proposal, and Israel decided to conduct an airstrike to try to eliminate the leadership of Qatar that is based foreignly, both in Turkey and Qatar. That airstrike was not successful. There were Hamas members that were killed, but the leadership, basically some of them were injured, but for the most part, the airstrike failed to eliminate the Hamas leadership based externally. And so this first part of the global intel, when we're talking about Israel, Qatar, Matt, I'd like to ask you kind of the overview of what we thought happened, what occurred, and kind of the geopolitical ramifications. And specifically considering that this airstrike failed, it's important to note that Israel decided to launch this airstrike against Hamas leadership based in Qatar because what they're claiming is the leadership of Hamas that's foreign based was responsible for the terrorist attack against a bus terminal located in Jerusalem that killed multiple Israeli civilians. Some of them were even dual citizens. I know for a fact one of them was also a Spanish citizen. And they decided to conduct this airstrike as a retaliation and arguing that the Hamas leadership that is based out of Qatar and Turkey was directly responsible. And it's important to note that Hamas, shortly after that a terrorist attack in Jerusalem, Hamas claimed responsibility for this attack. And a lot of the responsibility for that came from the foreign leadership, not necessarily the ones in Gaza that were based in Gaza, because really the Hamas leadership in Gaza is kind of unknown because a lot of the leadership has been killed in Gaza. And so they're operating in a sense in Gaza much more, let's say, decentralized. We don't really know, at least publicly, who's really responsible for the situation in Hamas in Gaza, but the foreign leadership based out of Qatar and Turkey, those are very much well-known names. And although the airstrike failed to assassinate them, they did hold kind of somewhat prominent positions externally. We do suspect, we know for a fact that the Hamas leadership in Qatar and Turkey are responsible for not only the negotiation, but let's say they're also responsible for external ops, right? Based out of the attack in Jerusalem. They're responsible for a lot of the propaganda arm. They are responsible for the international relationship. They do have somewhat important roles in Qatar, but they're not key figures for operations inside of Gaza. So do you think that the strike that Israel conducted, even though that it failed, let's say it succeeded and eliminated those leaders, do you think this was a wise decision? Because we know that President Trump and the White House was not happy with this specific airstrike.
No, honestly, I don't think this is a good idea, and I think it would be hard to argue that it was, although I'm sure it can be done. There are several different factors to take into account here. One of them being that a Qatari security officer was killed in this strike. Um, it's also a strike into the sovereign territory of not just Qatar, but thinking of Qatar in the broader framework of the region, it is a GCC state or Gulf Cooperation Council state. And so there's risk here that it could also undermine things like the Abraham Accords, that it could damage faith in the region from other GCC states, which so far have been more sort of benevolent towards Israel and their aims than they've traditionally been. So this really seems like a step too far, and it's one that I think that would be very wise not to repeat. But you also alluded to the fact that this they were meeting under the auspices of um, having a discussion around the terms that had been presented to them, which the United States has been involved in. And so this is going to set back those discussions. And I think from a domestic point of view within Israel, I think it's going to pose some political challenges for Netanyahu as it doesn't seem to be putting the fate of remaining hostages first. And I think that is something that is going to continue to sort of haunt his government. And we see this coming very quickly soon after the attacks into Yemen. And I can see a situation where the United States has a very frank talk with them because there's a real threat of escalation here.
No, and I think, Matt, what I allude to, I mean, I think clearly the White House and the United States did interpret this strike as being unwise. Subsequent reporting, like when it first originally happened, there was this kind of like consensus that there's no way the United States was not made aware of this strike. And I think President Trump was put in a very difficult position because he did say that in a Truth Social post, he said that Hamas, a proposal was sent for the ceasefire, and that part of that, Hamas had to release all the hostages. And this was, quote, their final warning. Literally the next day, Israel conducted the strike. Um, but subsequent reporting indicated that the United States was not given heads up for the strike, and that the only time they were given a warning was basically once the ballistic missiles were launched from the aircraft, from the F-15s or whatever platforms the Israelis do. The reporting indicates it was an F-15. Israeli F-15s, they launched air-launched ballistic missiles against Doha to target this compound that Hamas has used. It's a compound that actually a lot of foreign journalists has been based out of to interview Hamas, and that's based out of Qatar. And that seems to have caused a lot of consternation in the White House because they felt like, okay, Israel, there's no way we can have subsequent negotiations with this. And that was kind of the immediate aftermath of that strike, in which after the airstrike, there was a belief that there's no way that ceasefire negotiations can continue. And what we're seeing the United States do is basically damage control, right? They had to get involved with the Qataris, say, hey, we were not made aware of this strike, but this is not going to happen again. Um, right now, today, as of this recording, which is Sunday, September 14th, Marco Rubio is in Israel. And part of the reporting indicates that although he's there and he saw the Western Wall and he's showing this solidarity with Israel, that, Marco Rubio is really pressing the Israelis on a lot of the negotiations, not only involved with Gaza, but because of the strike involving Hamas and Qatar, and that he clearly the United States was not happy. Like Qatar is a major ally of the United States. They're a major non-NATO ally. Al Udeid Air Base is a key U.S. military base in the Middle East, serving multitude of purposes, not only against Iran, but more specifically also for the counter-ISIS fight in Iraq and Syria that continues to right now. And the United States, it does indicate, was not really given heads up of this strike until it happened, and they were not happy. I would say that the Israeli strike puts into question the ceasefire negotiations. But to be honest, I don't really think that the Israelis are necessarily interested anymore in ceasefire negotiations, and that they feel like Hamas has been dragging this out. They've been dragging out the situation of the hostages. Every time a proposal is sent to them, they come with unacceptable counterclaims or a counter proposal that's not acceptable to them. And what we've seen right now, at least in the situation in Gaza, is that Israel is clearly prioritizing their military offensive in Gaza. Right now, they've evacuated. The last report we got, over 300,000 civilians in Gaza City have evacuated because of Israeli warning. Israel has really expanded their airstrikes and ground operations in Gaza. And it's really giving the sensation that Israel might fully occupy Gaza, or at least certain segments of Gaza, and really pressure Hamas that way to get into negotiations. But clearly, Qatar, after the airstrike, did state we are not interested in being mediators anymore. And the reason why they're mediators, I think, is important to note, is because of the request of the United States. Qatar has generally served this purpose of being mediators. They did it with the Taliban in Afghanistan. Obviously, the United States needs a specific country where they can negotiate, at least indirectly, with Hamas, and they requested the Qataris to be that unofficial or at least official intermediary between Israel, the United States, and Hamas. We've seen Egyptian and Qatari negotiators serving as that middle point with Hamas and in the United States and Israel. And this was a request from the United States. So clearly, I can understand in some way, shape, or form the argument that Israel conducted the strike to target what's remaining of the leadership of Hamas. But the problem set is those key leaders that are based of Hamas, that are based out of Qatar and Turkey, that were focused for this airstrike, they're not really running the day-to-day operations in Gaza. They're not the key players in Gaza. They serve more from an international perspective, from a propaganda perspective, from a financial perspective, maybe from an external ops perspective. And Israel tied the airstrike against them because of the terrorist attack in Jerusalem that killed multiple Israeli civilians. But those figures in Qatar that were targeted aren't really, that we know of, and all the reporting we got, they're not really running the day-to-day operations for Hamas in Gaza. That's a completely separate department. That's the Gaza department that used to be led by Anwar Sinwar and then Mohammed Sinwar, and both of them have been killed. So I don't understand Israel's calculus for this. They really risked, upsetting the United States. They really put into risk the ceasefire negotiations. We've even seen protests inside of Israel because of the strike, because of a lot of the family members that have hostages in Gaza. And their perspective viewed this strike as basically the death of the negotiations. And I mean, they're not wrong. I mean, how can Hamas and Israel continue negotiations? And what it indicates is Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli Defense Forces are very much committed to occupying Gaza and continue their military campaign there. And they're not interested in ceasefire negotiations directly with Hamas.
Yeah, and I think we also have to take into account like some of the internal pressures politically that Bibi has found himself under. He is trying to hold together this coalition, which he turned to a lot of Israel's far right and potentially questionable characters to form this coalition. And they are pushing for sort of these maximalist aims. And I think, it's getting more and more difficult for people to argue that there's really anything left of Hamas that they can achieve militarily in Gaza, unless the aim is, like you said, for them to sort of take control of Gaza and occupy it. And that in and of itself also poses a risk because without a strong plan for reconstruction and trying to do something about the humanitarian situation, I think long term they're creating more instability for themselves, and they've been given a pretty long leash in terms of what type of strikes they've been able to carry out. And I think at some point that patience is really going to run out. And I also think with the United States, like you said, having so many partners in the region, especially among those GCC countries, there's going to be continued pressure from those countries if we see any continued strikes like this to really start to pull back on the support for Israel because this is reaching out into a GCC state, and they're not going to see that as acceptable. And especially because it was not successful, there's really not a whole lot that they're walking away from this with that I would put in the positive column.
I mean, we have seen, I mean, ironically, Saudi Arabia is saying, we did see in GCC a lot of the countries and the Middle East and the Arab world doing diplomatic communiques basically condemning the strike. Saudi Arabia was one of the key ones, and obviously is a key objective for the Abraham Accords, um, which is kind of ironic considering how Saudi Arabia has viewed Qatar in the context of the Muslim Brotherhood and Al Jazeera, and how historically the Saudi Arabians have viewed Qatar as being a destabilizing influence for the Middle East and a lot of these monarchies based out of the GCC, how the Al Jazeera has been destabilizing for them. But the Saudis have come out absolutely in favor of Qatar and condemning Israel, which kind of puts into question the context of the Abraham Accords. But I just this strike. I mean, I think it's important to note for our listeners when we're analyzing Hamas in the context of the leadership. The ones that are externally based are not really. We call them leaders, but they're not really running the day-to-day operations in Gaza. They're not the key figures that are running Gaza operations. They've basically been compartmentalized to the point that even a lot of the key figures of Hamas that were externally based were not even aware of Janwar Sinwar's plan for October 7th in 2023. They were not. They didn't even know about this before it happened, and even to this day, a lot of the reporting that we're getting is that they're not really involved in Gaza operations. That, from the Israeli perspective, that's the key aspect. We've seen Israel and the Israeli Defense Force expand targeted operations. The airstrikes lately have been targeting high-rise apartment buildings because Israel claims that they're being used for Hamas for military operations and targeting IDF forces that are going to be involved inside of Gaza. We've seen the Israeli Defense Force released. There's still that kind of, in many ways, baffles me. Israel continues to discover tunnels that Hamas is in Gaza that Hamas uses. Today, they announced that they killed 11 Hamas members in a tunnel in northern Gaza that belonged to a battalion that the Israelis previously said has been destroyed and is combat ineffective. And then they said, hey, we found the tunnel and members of this Hamas battalion, and they're still active. So it kind of shows resiliency from the perspective of Hamas. But a lot of these strikes that are targeting them, I mean, again, it's just it doesn't fit. If Israel's military objective is to defeat Hamas in Gaza, this strike doesn't really do much to expand it. Now, you can make the argument from the Israeli perspective that they just want to completely decapitate Hamas in its entirety, but the external ops, the members of Hamas that are based externally, are not those key figures. I mean, they're not really involved in a lot of the Hamas day-to-day operations in Gaza. They're not the key figures. I mean, it's even funny if you analyze it from the Palestinian perspective, if you analyze it from the perspective in Gaza, and you analyze it from the Telegram channels, the WhatsApp groups, et cetera, that kind of give news out of Gaza from a Hamas perspective, there has been heavy criticism of the Hamas leadership that's based externally for being out of touch for the situation on the ground. And not even from a Hamas perspective, but even just simply from a Gaza perspective, where they view the members of Hamas that are based out of Qatar and Turkey as being out of touch, that they don't necessarily know what's going on. And so I can see where some of these key Hamas figures that are based externally are involved in some way, shape, or form in external operations, because generally that's kind of the areas that we see. It's like ISIS, I'm sorry, not ISIS, Al Qaeda, the Haras al Din in Syria, that is the key Al Qaeda external ops faction or franchise that is involved in planning terrorist attacks against Syria, against Europe and the United States based out of Syria. Maybe we can see that being a case for some of these key figures of Hamas and Qatar. But in the end of the day, they're mostly symbolic, and they're involved in the negotiations. That's clearly their main roles. And so any military strike against them isn't really going to change the calculus on the ground in Gaza. And more importantly, for the Israelis, they run the risk of, I mean, Qatar is a country right now that has suffered an attack from Iran, the ballistic missile strike against IUD, and they've also suffered an attack from Israel, right? And if Israel's goal overall is for the Abraham Accords, this isn't going to achieve that objective. And so the question then that has to come to mind from a political sense is Benjamin Netanyahu not really interested in the Abraham Accords, and is he leveraging the situation in Gaza and Hamas to kind of continue this sense of perpetual war? Because I've said this in spaces on X, formerly known as Twitter, where I've been very heavily critical of the IDF in the sense that a lot of the operations they conducted in Gaza was not necessarily from a counterinsurgency perspective, but it was a counterterrorism perspective. And that they really didn't change much of how they would operating prior to October 7th, which, prior to October 7th, there was a saying that the Israeli Defense Force was mowing the grass, right? That was kind of the logic of the military campaign in Gaza, which was anytime there's a significant threat against Israel, the Israelis would conduct airstrikes in Gaza. They would conduct operations in Gaza to kind of cut key leaders, quote, mow the grass, to kind of to reduce that threat against Israel. And then, but the problem was they didn't target key leaders, and that's what enabled October 7th. After October 7th, how the Israelis were operating, the Israeli Defense Force was operating, was much more from a prism of counterterrorism, going in, maybe in some areas they would occupy key territory. But for the most part, they're not interested in a counterinsurgency perspective, which is really the way that the Israeli Defense Force can defeat Hamas in Gaza. Because I think there's not the political appetite to conduct those operations. Because in a counterinsurgency perspective, they would have to occupy and then be responsible for governance of Gaza. And the Israeli Defense Force has been very clear they do not want that. The Israeli political leadership does not want that. But that's the only way that the Israeli Defense Force can really damage and destroy Hamas's ability to operate in Gaza. That's the only way they can do it. But it would be interesting to see if now Israel's operations inside of Gaza, now that there's a new phase, a new plan inside of Gaza, is it from a prism of counterinsurgency, or are we going to see a repeat of basically Israel coming in, shortly occupy an area, try to destroy, quote unquote, Hamas infrastructure in the territory, Hamas leadership in the territory, and then they pull out without any subsequent plan to occupy the territory and prevent Hamas from regaining control? Because for all intents and purposes, Matt, Hamas is the primary military power of Gaza outside of Israel. There has been no plans to supplant or replace Hamas from a military perspective. And Hamas clearly has shown their ability that although they can't repeat on October 7th, although they can't launch rockets against Israel, at least from inside of Gaza, Hamas, for the most part, in many ways, has the monopoly of violence in the construct of Palestinian militants, and they're the primary military power inside of Gaza, and they still, to this day, are able to target anybody who wants to challenge Hamas's military power inside of Gaza.
I mean, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head. I think even though the appetite is waning, you're seeing protests. I think this is short-term thinking. I do think that the internal politics, especially Bibi's situation, is what really needs to be examined to understand his thinking here, because this continuation for him seems to be at least in part driven by his need to maintain his position, to avoid potential charges and being tried for those. And I think holding together that coalition, I think the goodwill, what is left of it, he's putting at serious risk right now, from those who are continuing to support Israel. And so I tend to agree. I think there are the stated objectives, and then there's what's happening on the ground. And to continue to reach out and into these countries that are allied with the United States, it's going to cause larger issues in the long run, especially if this isn't just a one-off.
I mean, it's interesting that how Israel conducted this operation was via airstrike and not ground operations like Mossad. Mossad, we've known, for example, in Iran, They've conducted the assassination against Hanei, which was a key leader of Hamas externally based in Tehran. There was interesting reporting indicating that that Mossad refused to participate in this operation and that kind of forced the Israeli Air Force to be the conduit for this strike. Um, that they had to leverage the Israeli Air Force to do it. Because one of the things that Mossad was concerned about was the relationship they managed to cultivate and build with Qatar specifically. Um, Clearly, this strike really does put into question the Qatari leadership. But I mean, obviously, there's not any concerns about the internal rule, but Qatar has not really backed down. They are furious with this airstrike, and I think a lot of us can understand why. Even though it was a targeted strike against Hamas leadership, one of the casualties was a Qatari security official. But again, it goes back to the conversation that we were having, which was the United States requested that Qatar serves as a mediator. And I think this is kind of a black eye from the perspective of the Trump administration saying, I just requested Qatar to be a mediator. This is my conduit to conduct negotiations. And Israel conducts a strike. I think it's not a good look. Qatar is a major non-NATO ally, a key ally of the United States. They buy a lot of military equipment from the United States. I think the conversations that Qatar is going to, because of this strike, might look at other foreign partners like China to kind of supplant the United States are completely overblown. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. But I think it was completely ill advised, and it really puts the United States in a very bad position, specifically the Trump administration, who, although has been at least vocally very hawkish, has continued the diplomatic route through Steve Witkoff. And that's where I think the Trump administration is really interested in ending this conflict and this war is through the diplomatic means, which ironically, a lot of the leadership of the Israeli Defense Force actually agrees with. Before kind of the military operations in Gaza, we got reporting from Israeli media that the Israeli Defense Force was not very confident in the Gaza operations. They were concerned about mission creep. They were concerned about exhaustion within the Israeli Defense Force because of how many personnel would require. And I think that's the problems that the Israelis are running into is that if they really want to defeat Hamas, it will have to mean they have to fully occupy Gaza. And we've already seen the pushback internationally. A lot of people have already started to heavily, the protest against Israel is only increasing internationally, specifically in Europe and the United States. We saw today in Spain, a major sporting event had to be canceled. The last leg, it's a biking race, had to be canceled because of protesters in favor of Gaza and the Palestinians. Um, Basically shut down a highway that was being utilized for the race. We're seeing increased level of flotillas heading out to Gaza, which interestingly enough, some of these flotillas look like have been targeted by the Israelis, specifically in Tunisia. And I think Israel and Benjamin Netanyahu's perspective is they're not really concerned about the consequences of their image internationally because they're much more concerned about the domestic reality. But in the long term, the question they always have to deal with is these type of operations might not be beneficial for Israel's long term, and that the pushback they're going to get internationally and from specifically Europe and the United States is just hampering their international image, and we're seeing it already on the ground. I just don't. I think you're right that a lot of these operations are being done much more from a domestic political consideration for Benjamin Netanyahu. Obviously, Hamas has a vested interest as well as continuing this war and probably putting much more hardline demands that the Israelis aren't going to accept. And so we're running a situation I think is, a situation where both parties are not interested in really solving this diplomatically. They're hunkering down their maximalist demands. The difference is, I think Israel does have the military capabilities to hit Hamas and areas that Hamas can't really, respond unless it's terrorist attacks, and that's what we saw in Jerusalem. And then clearly Benjamin Netanyahu and his cabinet, used the attack in Jerusalem as a justification for the strike in Qatar. But Qatar, for all the criticisms that people want to say, for Qatar being supporting the Muslim Brotherhood, for supporting extremism in the Islamic world, it's important to note that the reason why Qatar is a mediator between the United States, Israel, and Hamas is because of the request of the United States. And these type of strikes probably aren't going to really solve the situation diplomatically. And we're right now going back to a military first perspective. And I don't see any scenario really in the immediate term where the hostages are going to release, a ceasefire is going to be reached in Gaza. I think the next couple of months, what we're going to see is the conversation in Israel, Gaza, is just Israel's military occupation, not only of Gaza City, but maybe even much more of the Gaza Strip as a whole.
My one of the things that I would point out is when talking about Qatar, obviously there has been tension within the GCC, primarily due to what we've seen with Al Jazeera and some of the complaints that Saudi Arabia had there and the Muslim Brotherhood connections. But at the same time, it's kind of like the little brother where Saudi Arabia can bully them, but they're still going to stand up for their fellow GCC country. And that is where like it could potentially undermine the Abraham Accords, like we were discussing. Last thing I would say is if the United States is serious about a diplomatic end to this, which I believe they are, and they've indicated, maybe use a diplomat instead of Steve Witkoff, Trump's golfing buddy. That's just a free little word of advice to the Trump administration. But I think, obviously this is something to watch. It's been ongoing for quite some time, and I think the next steps that Israel takes are going to be very telling, and really solidify this track here. But moving on to the next topic. Russia's incursion with approximately 19 drones into Poland.
Yeah, we had a breaking news space on our X page, which is still available. It was recorded. So if everybody wants to listen in, on September 10th, we had 19 drones of the Russian Federation kind of breach Polish airspace. We did see not only Poland, but NATO as a whole kind of respond to this. The NATO Secretary General highlighted the commitments to not only the Polish Air Force, but the Dutch F-35s were involved. We saw Italian refuelers, tankers from the Baltics being dispatched down to Poland. We saw the German Patriots increase their readiness because of this. They shot down a significant amount of Russian drones that incurred into Polish airspace. And Poland, as a response, as was September 10th, activated Article 4 of the Washington Treaty for NATO, which basically conducts for consultations. And we've seen NATO highlight increasingly, as a response, not only from a diplomatic sense, but militarily, increase their presence into Poland. And then today, on Sunday, September 14th, we've seen a repeat of this where even Russian drones incurred into Romanian airspace. Now, it's important to note that Romanian authorities believe that it was not intentional, that the drones were targeting Ukraine, and it kind of falls within the historical norm of targeting Ukraine, and then some of them just went into Romanian territory. Again, that has happened in the past, not only against Romania, but in Poland. But the situation of September 10th, it's very hard to argue that those 19 drones that violated Polish airspace and impacted inside of Poland was somewhat of an accident. That's a significant amount. This wasn't like we've seen in the past where it's like one drone, et cetera, might have just incurred, violated Polish airspace and struck inside of Poland. These were 19 drones. And so the question that we had in the space, and again, everybody can listen into it when it happened, was, is this a situation where President Putin of Russia is trying to create a new normal? Is he trying to create a situation where NATO Article 5 is continuously tested? Now, after September 10th, I've alluded to, I never thought that this is going to really reach the level of Article 5, although a lot of Polish, not only civilian, but military targets did get impacted by the strike. It didn't really reach the realm of Article 5. But Matt, my question is a situation where President Putin is intent on testing Article 5, or was this just a one-off to send a message for NATO? That's the key question that I think requires some much more analysis and reporting.
Yeah, my assumption with Putin is obviously it's intentional, and that this is sort of maybe not necessarily testing Article 5, but it is testing NATO's resolve. They are testing response from NATO, seeing how the NATO troops, how they respond to it in real time, but also, what happens afterwards. And so I think they're trying to tiptoe towards what might be an Article 5 type response, but this wouldn't justify an Article 5 type response in my perspective. But there's also the danger of, as they continue, they call it it's sort of like salami tactics, where they continue to just take this small slice, these small steps towards whatever that red line is. And as long as there's not a measured pushback, then they continue to move the needle a little bit further. And I think there's some real questions based on some of the rhetoric that we've heard from the United States about, how eager would the United States be to come to uh, an Article 5 type response and support it. So Article 4 obviously is not Article 5. I think there's always some confusion when a story comes out that Article 4 has been activated. We have already seen some of the responses, but I think, this is just one more thing that the next time we have a big NATO meeting, what are the responses going to be? Are we going to see continued buildup of troops? Are we going to see the deployment of things like more air defense, surveillance, expand rapid response in border areas? Those are all possibilities that we might see. We might also see, not necessarily directly on the NATO side, although it would affect NATO, more military investment by some of those members on the Eastern Front there with Russia. And I think Putin, while trying to test the resolve of NATO, runs into an issue where by doing so, he can strengthen the resolve of individual members. And regardless, at the end of the day, that does make NATO stronger.
One of the responses because of this strike was that NATO announced that they're initiating Operation Eastern Sentry. We did see France send additional Rafale fighter jets into Poland. I believe the UK was another one. We have seen an increase of military posture into Poland, which was the most likely aspect of this, and still in a defensive nature. One of the questions that we're running into, though, is again, why would Putin do this now? If this was intentional, right? And after, we did the marathon podcast episodes kind of covering the summits that are occurring in Alaska, then subsequently from there, Washington, D.C. with the European Ukrainian allies. But President Putin met with President Trump in Alaska. The question is, why now would Putin do such a brazen attack at this scale? Because it's hard to make the argument that this was an accident. I mean, these were the President Trump alluded to. We don't know. He kind of said it might have been a mistake, an accident, and it's hard to kind of analyze that from the perspective of, is this a situation where President Trump is trying to be still deferential to President Putin? Because again, it's hard to make the argument that 19 drones incurring into Polish airspace was an accident. But we have seen a response. But the key question is, why now? Why would President Putin do this now? It's interesting again. President Trump over this weekend did release a statement into social, basically demanding NATO to kind of take a much more hawkish approach against Russia, in which the demand was that NATO countries stop purchasing Russian oil and gas, which I think is a valid criticism against some of these NATO countries that claim to be hawkish on Russia, but continue to purchase his oil and gas. And the other area where President Trump was very hawkish was in reference to China, because China has played a key role for Russia's military operations and invasion against Ukraine, and which President Trump demanded the European Union to follow the U.S. footstep and impose 50% to 100% tariffs on China, and hoping that is going to be the way that China kind of backs off from their support of Russia. So, we've seen some mixed messaging. Clearly, President Trump's through social and some of the rhetoric from the White House does indicate that patience is wearing thin. We'll see what measures the United States conducts against Russia. Specifically, on what I'm looking at is the Senate bill that really increases secondary sanctions against Russia to 500%. It's interesting that both Prime Minister Modi of India and President Trump released statements indicating that they're continuing negotiations on the tariff front, and they're trying to reach an agreement and kind of this aspect of solidarity. And United States and India are key allies and partners, and the negotiations are continuing. But I think it would be interesting to see if this strike against Poland really puts into question the patience that the Trump administration, the deferment that the Trump administration has been giving against Putin. And Poland specifically has been one of the countries in Eastern Europe that has been a very close ally of President Trump, right? And not only in this administration, but even the first administration, right? The very famous Fort Trump in Poland during the first administration. Clearly, Poland has been one of those key European allies that has managed the relationship with the United States and expanded it. President Trump even stated that not only the military presence in Poland, the U.S. military presence in Poland is going to continue, but there's even a possibility that might increase. And it would be interesting to see. We've seen European countries increase their military presence in Poland as a response to Russia's attack. It would be interesting to see if the United States follows suit. So I think right now, domestically, there's a lot going on that might hinder the Trump administration's ability to really address this, specifically related to the Charlie Kirk assassination, which, again, to our listeners, we did have breaking news spaces covering that, and we had a phenomenal space that really kind of talked about online radicalization and domestic terrorism related to Charlie Kirk's assassination. So I recommend everybody to listen to that. And maybe the Charlie Kirk assassination might have distracted the Trump administration from this geopolitical crisis, but we are seeing kind of this continuation of the Trump administration continuing to take a much more hawkish approach because patience is wearing thin against Russia. And I think it's important to note that what Russia right now is going on and suffering is a significant fuel crisis because of Ukrainian drone strikes. And so, is this a situation where, because nothing can be achieved diplomatically, and because of the attack against Poland, which, again, the question is, why would President Putin do it against, out of all countries, Poland, which has been a major ally of the United States, and why now? I think this might fit the mold where the Trump administration takes a much more hawkish approach. Time will tell, but I just don't understand why Putin would do this now. There wasn't really a trigger event. There was really nothing there. And the problem is now the situation can run into is because NATO stated in a statement that this is the first time that the NATO military alliance took measures to defend NATO airspace. And why would Putin do this against President Trump and not, let's say, not against Biden? Like, this never happened during the Biden administration.
I think it's because
Yeah,
of
go
those
ahead.
mixed, I think it's because of those mixed messages. For them being more hawkish, there is still a soft spot for Putin. And I think Putin is willing to exploit that and also sort of this is a slap in the face to the Trump administration. And I think it's a way of sending a message, already sort of bowed down to me, rolled out the red carpet, but just showing them that they don't have the influence that Trump likes to think he might have. And even with them taking more hawkish approach in some aspects, you still have Trump out there kind of trying to give Putin the benefit of the doubt and saying, could have been a mistake, could have been a mistake. That's not the type of reaction that is going to dissuade Putin from taking these actions. And one of the other things that I think plays into timing is we just had the discussion about the meeting of the nations in China. And I think China really showed a level of support for Russia that maybe shouldn't be a surprise, but has made Putin feel a little bit more comfortable. And we'll have to see what the reaction is from the United States. But there's a serious risk of miscalculation here. And like you said, scrambling um, fighter planes and actually taking kinetic action to knock down some of these drones, having to shut down an airport, move NATO assets, scramble NATO assets. Uh, it's no small thing. So,
I
the
mean, it
risk of
wasn't even one
miscalculation.
airport. It was four airports to include Warsaw International Airport. I mean, this was a significant attack that I don't think it really people understand how significant this was. I mean, this is the first time since really September 11th of 2001 where a NATO member was attacked. Now, granted, it's not the same level of severity from September 11th, but it's still the first time that such a significant event happened within the NATO alliance that required not only the Polish Air Force to really intercept, but we saw a NATO response. Again, Dutch F-35s played a key role. German Patriots were part of the defense. Italian, support and maintenance and refuelers out of the Baltics were sent down to support the Polish Air Force. And even today, on September 14th, as this recording, after the a possibility of an additional drone incursion, which was I think it was a lot less severe as the first incident. We did see a significant NATO response and Polish response to that, where a lot of drones that were encouraging into Ukraine and conducting attacks against Ukraine, there was a concern that they were going to reach into Poland, and we did see air sirens sound off in eastern Poland. I don't think any of the attacks today against Ukraine necessarily bled over into Poland. We did see some of that into Romania. What was interesting that the Romanian government said, we do not suspect that this was a deliberate attack against Romania, that this was accidental, but the incident earlier against Poland, where the 19 drones occurred, I mean, it universally, not only within NATO, but even within a lot of aspects of the U.S. Congress, we saw senators, congressmen openly declare this was a deliberate attack. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't something we saw in the past. I just, because I understand the ability, the mixed messaging and all that, but there's a part of me, I think the fundamental problem that we're running into when analyzing Russia and President Putin is, I think there's this idea of, okay, they're testing Article 5, they're maybe testing NATO response perspective. You know, I think that's an overtly optimistic way of analyzing President Putin, in the sense that he's actioning not necessarily as a rational actor, but a rational actor within Russia's geopolitical influence, et cetera, right? And this idea of Russia's security interest. And so that the action he's doing gives the benefit of the doubt that he's a rational actor and that he's doing this to test NATO. I'm of the firm belief that Putin is not a rational actor, that his military operation since the invasion against Ukraine in 2022 till now has demonstrated that Putin is not operating in the sense of reality, that he's giving false information, that the Russians believe their own propaganda, that Ukraine is going to fold, that maybe that this idea that NATO military presence, that thousands of NATO military troops are in Ukraine. And because it doesn't, why would Putin run the risk of making Trump the first US president where Article 5 is tested since September 11th, when President Trump has been so differential? I fundamentally believe if you're a rational actor, what we analyze is President Putin was going to do everything possible to extend the negotiations as long as possible. And this attack instigated Trump to take a much more hawkish approach. I just don't believe that the analysis of President Putin being a rational actor is correct. I truly believe that they believe their own propaganda, that they're not operating in the reality of the sense and the problem sets that Russia has encountered in Ukraine from a military perspective, and that they truly believe that, victory is imminent. And not only is victory imminent in Ukraine, but a victory in Ukraine will quickly translate into a collapse of NATO. And I just don't think that's a rational analysis on the situation on the ground.
So I would agree. I don't think that Putin is a rational actor, and I think both can be true. I think that this can be a testing of NATO and of red lines, but in a more nefarious sense, because I do think, like, and it's been reported on fairly widely that, Putin's goal is to push back the borders of NATO to 97. Like he has that as a goal, and he thinks that is something that he can achieve. And so what does he achieve by testing these red lines? I don't know if it's like a approach to try and normalize it. I think from a NATO perspective, this could be an opportunity to start a level of defense of Western Ukraine and the airspace there. Uh, so that's something that, I would also keep an eye on, because I don't think that it's having the effect that he thinks it might have. I think he miscalculated, like you said, with the war in Ukraine, and one of those stated goals, and one of the things that he's had his eye on the rest of the Carpathian Plain for a long time, and he has this dream of recreating the Soviet Union. His incursion into Ukraine has had the opposite effect, and you do have to wonder if he's really aware of how he is perceived. And I think that's where some of the treatment and deference that Trump has shown has been damaging, and might be one of the reasons why he's been a little bit more comfortable with actions like this. But China hasn't really shown any indication that they'll distance themselves from Putin. And so I think that might have also played a role. But it's not a good development, and we'll have to see what this means long term, as with so much of this. But I don't think he's a rational actor, and I don't think that any plans that pertain to Russia should be constructed under the assumption that Putin is a rational actor.
No, and I think that's the key question. And then what kind of continues? We've seen kind of solidarity within the European allies with Poland. President Trump's Truth Social post is a very interesting one. I wonder if it's kind of like contingent if Europe does follow suit and kind of follows, because originally the European Union, the reporting we got was not interested in broad sanctions and wanted to focus on more targeted sanctions, which honestly I don't think is really going to have an impact in both either for China or Russia. At this point, it has to be broad based. Against the Ukrainians have increased their drone strikes against oil refineries in Russia. That has really caused a fuel crisis that even has been acknowledged by Russian media. A lot of the fuel crisis there has really impacted it, not only in the sense of disruption of fuel and gas, but even inflation, et cetera. So I would concur with Trump that targeted sanctions aren't going to work, that they have to take a broad approach. And it would be interesting to see if Europe answers that perspective and takes a similar approach. And that might be kind of a way where the Trump administration might take Lindsey Graham's kind of bill, which with the secondary sanctions of up to 500% tariffs on secondary sanctions, might make it through. So I think this is a moment for Europe to realize that, hey, great, we appreciate the increase of military deployment on Poland and Eastern Europe as a whole, but there's much more that needs to be done, specifically the sanction place. So we'll see if Europe takes a much more hard stance approach, because Trump really, in his Truth Social, kind of made that contingent on him taking a much more severe approach against Russia, saying, why would the U.S. take a much more severe approach against Russia if Europe, who's buying Russian oil, is not going to take it? So I think there's a lot of questions remaining. A lot still has to be analyzed outside of the military deployment, and we'll see at the diplomatic side. But to kind of round out this episode, Matt, what we also see this week is two key developments. One that maybe got much more attention on social media than the other. The first one, obviously, is the protest in Nepal, the Gen Z protest, in which the government has been overthrown, and the situation where the new prime minister of Poland was elected in discord. At first, I think, in history. But, the protests in Nepal were very much anti-corruption protests, directed against the Nepal government. And it would be interesting to see, I mean, because a lot of this, I think it's important for our listeners to note, is a lot of this was actually domestic related. Like a lot of times when we're analyzing situations around the world, we try to analyze it from a foreign relations, from a geopolitical, but Nepal was clearly one of those cases which it was purely domestic. It was widespread protest, not only in the capital of Kathmandu, but across the country. And clearly the military even had to kind of get involved to really stabilize the situation, but the government had to flee, resign, and now we have a new prime minister in office who again was elected via Discord, which as crazy as that sounds, as the actual fact, and alludes to maybe the future of and highlights the aspect of the protest, which were Gen Z. I mean, that's literally the name of the protest was Gen Z to highlight the youth who are involved in these significant protests over to the government and really paralyzed the country. I mean, we saw a situation in Nepal, which I think I was talking to this in the background with other reporters. The term I use, like, look, this is a revolution. I mean, this isn't just protest. This really fundamentally changed the situation on the ground in Nepal. This was one of those situations where we saw the government had to flee. I think the prime minister, the previous prime minister, fled to India. Again, maybe it's the interesting analysis has to be made with the new Nepal government. Is this a situation where they have closer relationships with India or China? Nepal is one of those countries where we've seen both India and China compete to be kind of their most favored partners and kind of this Indian China tensions in South Asia. That would be maybe something that we would have to analyze and be interested in. But that protest was very significant, and although it was days, it was kind of the fleeing of the prime minister. I think a lot of people, when they started to analyze Nepal, was once it hit a critical point. Once the prime minister fell, we saw the parliament being burned down. We saw government institutions across the country being attacked. But the protests were much longer than just that one day. It was widespread across the country and very significant, where the Nepal police and law enforcement weren't able to control the situation, and the military kind of took a step back and only intervened after the government fell and a new government was imminently going to come into office. That's when we saw the Nepal military coming in. So it would be interesting to see what happens to Nepal. This is kind of the second major protest revolution movement that Nepal has seen in the 21st century. The first one, obviously, being with the Nepal monarchy being overthrown and Nepal becoming a republic. So again, it would be interesting to see how Nepal continues with the new government and analyzing it also from foreign relations geopolitical sense in this construct of India and China. That's something that both countries have vested interest inside of Nepal, and we've seen governments inside of Nepal either being much more aligned to China or India, depending on the situation. I would say that China has probably gained much more influence in Nepal prior to this protest and revolution. They're the ones that was getting the most. But now with this new government, it'll be interesting to see if that continues and kind of what measures happens. But I think a lot of this was geared more towards a domestic politics situation.
It's sort of a continuation. This protest has showed sort of the power of online networks, even like memes and social media. That it's something that we saw in their spring, the ability to organize. And one sort of has to wonder, are we going to see any other examples where something along these lines might take place in South Asia, where they might have similar demographics or similar grievances, especially now that you've seen that it was successful?
And I think that's the key question. And I think a lot of us don't realize the power of online. I mean, this was a key example of anti-corruption measures taken and not necessarily comparable to other situations. But I mean, I go back to what I mentioned earlier in the episode, the space we had on X, formerly known as Twitter, where we had experts talk about kind of online radicalization within the construct of U.S. domestic terrorism and how that happens. And I think that's something that is not getting enough conversation and warranted. And again, there was a phenomenal space that we had. I recommend everybody to listen to it. But one of the aspects of this conversation was when analyzing extremism and domestic terrorism from the United States, a key connecting point between all the examples is online radicalization. You can analyze it from left-wing extremism. You can analyze it from right-wing extremism, racially motivated extremism, eco-terrorism, the situation in Israel, Gaza. But inside the United States, a lot of that is basically tied to online radicalization. And looking at Nepal, not necessarily wanting to use the term radicalization, but the role that the social media played instigating this revolution, right? I mean, it has been a key component of it, and the Gen Z protest maximized it. And I think that's how they were able to really overthrow the government because the government wasn't able to quickly respond to adapt to the situation. And even the measures that the government took, for example, banning social media and banning messaging groups like Telegram and WhatsApp, if anything, backfired because they said they were going to ban it, but they really didn't do anything to actually ban it. Those platforms were still accessible in Nepal, and it just caused a situation where the protesters were incentivized more to continue to protest and go for basically the overthrow of the government, which is what we saw. I mean, the Nepal prime minister fled in a helicopter, and now that's the situation. So I think your example of online, I think that's the future of revolution. We've already seen this in the past. I mean, if you look at just even the Arab Spring, right? The Arab Spring had a key component of leveraging online social media, specifically Facebook, to conduct a lot of the revolutions. If anything, since the Arab Spring over a decade ago, this society as a whole internationally has been much more engaged online, has been much more involved there. So I think that's the next situation. Um, what I would highlight is social media is going to play a key role in a lot of international developments, and social media is going to be the defining factor in a lot of these protest movements. And that's why we're seeing governments, specifically Russia, try to close off a lot of those aspects and social media access. And so that's something to keep on looking on. We've seen China do it, we've seen Russia doing it, we've seen Iran, North Korea, etc. So this is somewhere where a lot of authoritarian governments are rightfully going to see social media as a threat, and that's where we're going to go to. But to end this episode, Matt, I do want to briefly touch upon a situation that I think a lot of our listeners might not be aware of, and that's the situation related to Afghanistan and Pakistan. Um, Afghanistan and Pakistan, obviously, ever since the Taliban came back to power, there has been tensions with both countries, specifically within the realm of the Pakistani Taliban, TTP. A lot of their base of operations are in Afghanistan. They have a lot of camps based out of Afghanistan that they've managed to leverage to conduct attacks into Pakistan. And yet, yesterday, September 13th, we saw 19 Pakistani soldiers killed in widespread attacks by the Pakistani Taliban across various areas in Pakistan. And what the Pakistani media is claiming is that 45 militants of TTP and terrorists were killed in this. What I've noticed is that Pakistani media is demanding, and specifically social media, is demanding a response. And we've seen reporting indicating that maybe Pakistan is going to take much more overt strike operations against TTP inside of Afghanistan, which probably might increase tensions with the Afghan Taliban. It's important to note that both the Taliban government and Afghanistan and Pakistan have had a lot of tensions, specifically related to border disputes and border tensions, where we've seen both sides clash severely because of it. We've seen Pakistan conducts strikes inside of Afghanistan and even covert operations inside of Afghanistan against the TTP. But this latest attack might be one of those cases where Pakistan takes a much more severe response against the Taliban government in Afghanistan. The question then is, obviously, is this another region where we might see an increase of threat of war between both countries? Is this somewhere we can be managed? But I do believe that I would recommend our listeners to kind of keep track on the situation of Afghanistan, Pakistan, because it's kind of recent, but there's a lot of underlying tension, historical tension, and this might be a region another area where we see conflict expand much more so than it has already in the past.
I think this is something that could potentially warrant a full episode in the near future. I think there are a lot of factors at play here. There's the narco aspect. I know you focus a lot on the narco aspect in South America and Central America, but that is also something that is at play here. It's shifting into Pakistan as the Taliban in Afghanistan cracks down. And we have groups like ISIS-K to take into consideration. And as long as the two countries are focused and uh, dealing with these cross-border strikes and hardening their diplomatic positions, it doesn't allow much bandwidth for counterterrorism operations or to take a counterterrorism posture, while the two are focused mainly on each other. So as we see increased opium production in Pakistan, we have to take into consideration one of the things that this has often led to is increased financing for militants and criminal networks that thrive off of narco money. Um, and we're not seeing that type of focus from Pakistan. Another thing that I think is worth keeping in mind is in some ways this is the result of uh, issues that Pakistan has had with its military and intelligence agency for a long time, where it has focused on the support of the United States and playing that role while simultaneously having elements that have been sympathetic to the Taliban and other extremist organizations. And this is a situation that I don't see going away anytime soon. We had in December of 2024 airstrikes that were blamed on Pakistan were conducted by Pakistan. So this is something that is continuing to escalate, and there are a lot of little factors in the background and a lot of potential consequences of of these tensions as they increase and as they distract those countries um, from other aspects at play in the region. So it's certainly something that is very important to keep an eye on, especially with the history that the United States and NATO has had in that region as well.
I think the key question before we wrap this episode up, Matthew, is that this attack that the TTP did, is that going to be a catalyst for a much more overt and significant response? We're starting to see Pakistani social media and even state media identify the Taliban government in Afghanistan as being a threat to Pakistan's national security. Um, and obviously, the harboring of TTP that the Afghan government has decided to do inside of Afghanistan clearly is not doing them any favors. And that's the next aspect. Again, we've seen Pakistan conduct significant covert operations against the TTP inside of Afghanistan. We've seen them conduct, kind of surgical strikes there. Is this a situation because of this attack that happened yesterday that broadens Pakistani's military operations there? Because we have seen a significant increase recently of TTP operations against Pakistan, and a lot of that is based on their access to Afghanistan specifically to conduct those operations. I think the question we're running into is not in a scenario of if, when does the Pakistani tolerance of the Afghan Taliban government runs out and they start directly connecting both the Afghan Taliban and the Pakistan Taliban as basically being the same point of the same problem, and they conduct strikes accordingly. And does that kind of instigate a wider war in South Asia? Time will tell. We don't know exactly what the Pakistani response is going to be. The Pakistani government has not responded to this latest strike yet. It's pretty fresh, but that's the next thing we're looking into. And I really wanted to end this episode with our listeners understanding that keep an eye on Afghanistan and Pakistan, because that has a lot of the indications and indicators of being the next conflict in the world between two nation states. So I think keep an eye on that because that's a key development.
And I think that is a good place to end. Stefano, thank you as always for walking through these events with us. We will talk to you soon. This has been the Bottom Line Up Front.